The Athletic.
The race is on, and the Spanish Grand Prix will be the acid test for whether F1 really has converged at the front, or if the recent challenges to Red Bull are more down to an unusual run of circuits. So what should we expect in Barcelona, and what will it tell us about the rest of the season? I'm Ed Straw, and joining me to tell all are Mark Hughes and Diego Mejia. Well, Diego, welcome back. We haven't had you on for a while. Of course, Diego from Fox Sports Mexico. How's the F1 season treating you?
Well, hello, Ed. Mark, it's great to be with you guys again here. Season has been going well. It's been entertaining of lately with the different teams and drivers being able to be a match for Red Bull and Max at these last few tracks. But I guess we're about to see whether that's going to be possible for the rest of the season, or if we're going to find out that suddenly Red Bull is back into dominant form. But I guess out of this last stretch of races, it's been quite entertaining, and it has somewhat portrayed a different kind of season that what we had seen up until China, I guess.
And of course, Diego as well is the voice of the race in Spanish on YouTube. So if you'd rather hear something a little bit better and a bit more Spanish than you get from the likes of me and Scott on our videos, you can head there. And Mark Hughes as well, going to the Spanish Grand Prix. That's obviously classic territory, isn't it? One of the staple circuits.
Well, it's the most aerodynamically demanding circuit probably of all of them. It's got the biggest mixture of demand, so it's a lot of different speed corners. It's that's a key challenge for especially with this generation of car, which they produce a lot of downforce at high speed, but are a bit clunky at low speed, and so getting them to remain balanced through a speed range is very difficult, and that's what the Red Bull has historically been so good at. It demands a lot of aero efficiency. It's kind of a very long straight there. And it places a big range of demand. So it's always been the sort of litmus test for, right, how good is a car really? Because you get all these different swings favoring certain aspects, different. So like in Miami, it was all about the surface at the very high temperatures not gripping up, and you had to get the tire working in the right way. At Imola, you need to use the curbs a lot. So any car that wasn't working well over the curbs, it was going to have to be extremely good somewhere else to more than compensate for that. Monaco, Montreal, they're both very bumpy and short, low-speed corners. So not much variation there. So if you get your car working like Mercedes did in Montreal over a circuit that's not too demanding of the speed range, you could, maybe get the car to work better than it might at a circuit in such as Barcelona. That's not to say we think the Mercedes won't work at Barcelona, but it's very interesting to see whether it will or won't. So, historically, it's been the sort of circuit that should really, really suit the Red Bull. But we don't know now, because the McLaren and Ferrari in particular have made so much progress. The Ferrari is very good on low speed and pretty good on high speed. The McLaren is very good on high speed, and since its upgrade in Miami, pretty good on the low speed as well. So they're making gains there. So this is the first real litmus test where we see, right, where are we really? And then that should give us a good guide, a good foundation guide for the rest of the season, really.
And of course, especially after some very specific circuits, it's the start of a run of slightly more conventional ones. It's the start of a triple header with Austria and Silverstone, of course, to follow. So, very, very interesting times after the challenges to Red Bull. But of course, Red Bull still won 2 out of 4 races. Could easily have been 3 out of the 4 had Miami gone their way. With the run of play being normal, they probably would have won in Miami. So, Diego, if you were in Red Bull's shoes, how would you be viewing the mounting challenge from the chasing pack?
Well, I guess it's legitimate. I guess it's been a stretch of the season where we've seen very different tracks, as Mark was explaining very well. Very different characteristics from Miami, Imola, Monaco, and Canada. very different requirements, some traits similar in those, but in the end, not very as telling as Barcelona could be about what we can expect for the rest of the year. Obviously, the season as a whole, up until now, hasn't been probably as easy as it was looking a year ago for Red Bull for different reasons. To some extent, there had to be some distraction out of all the nonsense going on there even before the season started. Things have seemed to calm down since Adrian's departure, or the announcement, basically renewing Checo. But specifically, I guess more Imola was a race which probably caught my eye, because it was when they last introduced a reasonable upgrade. And as you very well explained in this podcast some weeks ago, things didn't work straightforward. They had to do a lot of testing, a lot of simulation running, many hours for the sim drivers, and they finally got the car in a decent place and just managed to beat Lando Norris to the finish. So I think in some ways things aren't, as easy for Red Bull as they were a year ago. Let's see how this development battle continues to unfold. There's this talk of, convergence in performance, and that being somewhat of an explainer of why are we having this, battle, or what looks to be a battle, just watching the last 4 races, which have been very different to what we saw in the first 5. I mean, if you add the points from the drivers in the last 4 races, you'll have Verstappen just 11 points ahead of Norris, 22 ahead of Leclerc, who didn't score in the last one, Piastri back there, and Checo would be 8th in that ranking. So I guess it draws a picture of what has gone on recently. But I guess, we definitely need to see what happens, not only at this race, but how this battle unfolds, because there seems to be probably more performance to get from those things trying to catch up with Red Bull than probably what Red Bull has still to show. I expected something big at Imola. It was a very tight win for Max there, but let's see how it pans out this weekend in Barcelona.
It's interesting, isn't it, Mark? Because we've talked about some of the outlier circuits, Monaco perhaps the most extreme outlier on the calendar, but Barcelona's kind of slap bang in the middle, isn't it? Because of what you described, that wide range of corner speed profiles. So it's a real test of a car that can be the all-rounder, which the Red Bull has been. I think it was their 3rd strongest circuit last year in terms of single lap pace percentage advantage over the rest. Suzuka was close, but maybe a tiny bit closer than that. And really, if you're Red Bull, you're going there expecting that you will have the edge. And if you don't have the edge, you'd be quite worried, wouldn't you?
Yeah, you'd be going there nervously expecting, but I think being prepared for the bad news that might be on its way, which is that the others really have caught up, and it gets potentially very, very interesting indeed if we go to Barcelona and you have a very closely matched Red Bull, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, jumble up that order a little bit any way you want. But then the Red Bull, even with the championship lead that Max currently has, you would not be confident. You would know that you were in for a fight. Like they haven't had since 21.
The flip side of this coin, of course, is that while Red Bull might not have the comfortable car performance advantage they've often had, it's a great chance for them just to remind everyone how good they are at execution. Christian Horner was asked after the race in Canada what allowed them to win, and he just said just really good execution by team and driver. And obviously in Max Verstappen, they've got somebody who is always pushing for the absolute maximum, delivers brilliantly. The race team makes hardly any mistakes. They're generally very good at getting the best out of the car. So I guess that, Diego, is a strength that doesn't go away no matter what the car pace is. Red Bull are a razor-sharp racing team, and this period's throwing that into stark relief, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, out of those last four races I've mentioned before, I guess Max won two of them, which were weekends where Red Bull probably wasn't the best team. Wasn't the fastest team, I'd say. Probably it was the best team because together they made the right choices, not only in terms of strategy, but in the end, setup, everything allowed them to win where probably other drivers or other teams should have won just based purely on performance. But yeah, that's definitely something that's not going to go away. Right now, and looking at those last four races, Red Bull is battling basically with Max. Checo needs to catch up, but we'll touch on that later, I guess. But yeah, that's a strength. You don't see that going away because, yeah, things have been much more calm at Red Bull for the past few weeks after the very, difficult start to the year. But yeah, we'll see. I mean, until I'd say probably, Japan, maybe even China, we were used to seeing Max win by this sort of pit stop worth a gap to second place. We'll see if that's going to be the case again or not. But I hope it's not, because that would open the options of having more of a battle at the front, at least for the fight for the win every weekend. But yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting what happens this weekend in terms of the relative performance of Red Bull rivals.
Yeah, that's the great thing. If you can have 2, 3, 4 teams all up there at similar pace, then it gets really exciting, and it is all in the execution. But Mark, we should talk a little bit about Mercedes, because they could have won in Canada. They do seem to be making tangible progress. Do you think Spain's going to provide confirmation that it's not another of the full storms we've repeatedly seen? That goes back all the way to the first one we saw in this rules era, Barcelona, back in 2022, when suddenly things seemed to click, and that was meant to be a turning point, but wasn't really.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's we don't know, and as you say, we've had so many false dawns. But that car in Montreal at times was the fastest car in the place, and the reasons they were given for the improved performance and the problems that they had with the old wing and why this new wing had fixed them, and it all sounded perfectly logical and tallied with what we were seeing in front of our eyes, but as we touched on before, Montreal, the corner speed spread is very small. All the corners are almost the same speed. So if you've got a car where you're struggling to get the same balance at low speed and high speed, it's going to be disguised a little bit by a circuit like that where the corner spread isn't very high. You can just set it up to get the balance you want, and it should stay relatively consistent. So the fact that they've got the car competitive shows that if it's in the right balance window, it's got the aerodynamic performance necessary to be competitive. Can it retain that ability to stay in the balance window over a lap when we go to a circuit with a bigger spread of corner speeds, so that the problem that you classically have that they have had is that the car is it has a lot of rear end grip because of the at high speed. But as you're running the car lower and lower, as you're getting a better understanding of the underfloor aerodynamics, then the front wing was exposed as a problem because its grip ramped up too much at higher speeds as the car's lowered itself down on the suspension. And all of a sudden, the aero balance is moving forward very suddenly. So you've got a car which is very nervous in the high speed. So if you set it up so that you don't get that, then it was slow with understeer in the low speed. So if they've really, really cracked that problem rather than just improved it, then it will show at Barcelona.
And of course, the team's quite realistic, I think, about it. James Allison, the technical director, has talked about the fact that they probably looked a bit quicker than they naturally are in Montreal because of the characteristics, and expect to be competitive but not right at the front, I think was the phrase he used in Barcelona, which is a good step, isn't it, Diego? Because we don't know this isn't a full storm. It looks like it probably isn't, but that's the problem with false dawns, isn't it? It looks like you turn the corner and then suddenly you haven't. But this should confirm that Mercedes is at least on a credible trajectory, which means they could have weekends later in the year where they're potentially able to win on merit.
Yeah, exactly. We are about to see whether it's a real breakthrough or just, as you said before, a falls down. I guess the noises from James Allison echo some of those from George Russell after the weekend, where he too was sort of saying, I mean, what we found here is not just about this track, it's about more of an overall picture of the car and should show elsewhere. Whether that's going to be enough for them to be fighting for pole in Barcelona, maybe not, but it's going to be, like giving some continuity to what they've showed in Canada, start building on that and maybe catching up later. And I guess Mark's explanation is quite telling about what we can expect. He very well said about this more variety of profile of corners around Barcelona than we had in Canada, but here we find mostly the other end of the type of corners that you found around Gilles Villeneuve. I mean, mostly very quick corners. Once they got rid of this chicane on the last sector in Barcelona, they took out 2 more corners which were quite slow, or 3 maybe, and now you only have, I guess, turn 5 and turn 10, which are really, let's say, slow corners. The rest is medium high, so that could play to the strengths and what they found from the car, and they can maybe tune it more and make it be in a better window to perform as they probably did 2 years ago, when they suddenly found out the car was performing very well, but just a few days later they found that they couldn't keep that up for the rest of the season.
And I think the great thing is the fact that there's now 3 teams we can talk about as challenging Red Bull on any given weekend. That means there should be one of those cars with its different characteristics is at least able to be close enough to make something happen. I think Red Bull will probably win more races than the other teams to the rest of the season. They probably should still win the championship. Still a long way to go, could change, but that's just great for people tuning in to watch on the weekend, because there's real battles to be had, and Red Bull won't have that margin. Before we get on to our next topic, a quick reminder that the Race Members Club is now available on Patreon. We launched that last week and we're delighted to say we've had a great uptake. So hello to everyone who's listening to this ad-free in our Patreon feed already. Now, the Race Members Club continues unchanged for existing members who want to stick with that. It's not going to impact what you're getting, so hello to you as well. But Patreon allows us to further develop our members offering. And of course, everything you've always got for free from the race, including this podcast, will continue. So if you are listening to this via Patreon, leave us a comment under this episode in the Patreon feed to say hello. Right, well, let's move on to the topic we're contractually obliged to address when we have you on, Diego, because of your specialist insight, and that's Checo Perez. Obviously, you focus on him a lot through your Fox Sports Mexico work. What do you make of his recent troubles?
Well, it looks very much like last year. I must say, at some point, it's starting to develop exactly in the same way. Probably what Checo and his side of the garage do will somewhat dictate whether it ends in the same way or if he has already touched bottom, and Canada was the lowest point of this downward spiral that he has been into since a few races ago. I guess since the car hasn't been in the right window, since they introduced the upgrades in Imola, he has struggled a lot more with the car than Max. Basically, since the others have catch up, Checo has been in trouble with the car, not being able to perform as close as Max as he was. I mean, we remember in Japan, in Suzuka, it must have been probably one of his best ever qualifyings. Probably wasn't Max's ultimate lap around Suzuka, but Checo got very, very close to Max there. But since then, he hasn't been able to replicate that. And now that the car is not as dominant as he was right until Suzuka, he finds himself, losing to many other drivers and many other teams and being farther down. sometimes 0.3 or 0.2 of a second away from Max means that he's not able to go through Q3 or Q2 even. So that's put him in a very difficult place. This year, his approach is quite different. Last year, at the end of the year, he found out that he basically had been trying to tune the car in such a way that he would be able to get a better feeling of it. And even if that meant deviating from Max's setup, he thought that going through that way, he would find the pace that he needed to be close to Max. In the end, that wasn't the case. He admits that was a mistake. So this year, his approach is much more trying to stay close to what Max is doing. Maybe the little differences here and there to fine tune the car around what he needs. But he's putting more the weight on him to try to adapt more to what the car needs to be quick than adapting the car to what he needs. I remember at some point in the recent races, not exactly which race, but I was listening to his radio and he was asked by Hughes-Bird, his engineer, about what he needed in terms of a setup change they were going to do, and Checo's reply was, "What is Max doing?" And Hughes-Bird replied, "What do you need?" Like, okay, we understand that we don't want to deviate too much from what Max is doing, but let's not get obsessed by that philosophy. So it's very hard for him at the moment. Hopefully, the strengths of the RB20 that we expect to see at Barcelona allow him to get in the right place in terms of putting the car where he needs to put it, basically being 2-3 tenths away from Max at the most in qualifying. At some shorter laps like Red Bull, that can be a lot, so he needs to be much, much closer. I guess probably then the team needs to sort of adjust his run plans and some things around what Checo needs to, because he definitely takes a little more time to adapt to a car that is not very easy to drive. But if the team gives him what he needs and he delivers, he should be up there where he was at the beginning of the year. Let's see.
Yeah, you said at the start of the season at the launch, I remember asking him, because he was talking about learnings from last year. And I said, well, do you mean one of the things is making sure you're focusing on yourself, doing your own thing rather than trying to duplicate Max? And he said, yeah, absolutely, focusing on myself. But as you've alluded to there, maybe when things get a bit difficult, it starts to become harder to do that and easier to look on the other side of the garage and try and emulate. But Mark, is it just a case of the trend we often see when you've got a very good driver alongside a great one? Often we see as the car is developed and maybe pushed into a range that can be quicker but trickier, which is where Max can take a car, you tend to see a bit more of a gap develop. I think we saw this on occasions with Bottas and Hamilton as well.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that. There's an element of that difficulty then feeding on itself in terms of your confidence, and you get into a bit of a downward spiral as well, psychologically. I think that his best stuff seems to be when the car is relatively stable and benign. But as soon as they develop it in a direction which is probably led by Max's feedback, not Max deliberately sort of taking a car away from Checo, just Max asking for things that that he wants from the car to be quicker. The car tends to become edgier. It certainly has the last couple of seasons. In that you need to be a bit more able to handle its nervousness in order to extract its ultimately better potential. But it can be a lonely place if the other driver's excelling in that process and you seem to be going in the opposite direction. So that they're not going to follow you. If the car's if this direction is making the car go quicker with Max, they're not going to have much time to consider what you need. You're just going to have to get set up as good as you can get it within whatever the new constraints are of the car as it's being developed. And that's a very, I can imagine that's a very taxing and demanding and lonely place to be. We've seen in the past Checo many times bounce back from difficulties. He's quite tough mentally, I think. But no matter how mentally tough you are, that's for a sportsman, an elite sportsman, competing at this level, that's going to hurt, and it's going to do some psychological damage.
There's one suggestion going around, Diego, that I must admit I'm not really on board with. Helmut Marko said this, Christian Horner's said this in a press conference, was sort of maybe half joking, but there was this suggestion that kind of contract time led to Perez delivering his best work, and once he's got the new contract, suddenly he's fallen off a cliff because he's not trying or something. I must admit, I've never seen that in Perez. Do you see any evidence of that?
Not really. I mean, if you go back to China, I guess Christian Horner was there in the FIA press conference, and he was asked about what more he needed to see from Checo to sign his new deal, and he said he wanted to see more consistency, this and that. But they announced his new contract right after he had already been through the start of this rough patch, so it doesn't really add up to what they were saying before. I don't think that's the case. I mean, it boils down mainly to, I guess, to the points that we've mentioned, and I guess his mentality doesn't change because he has the safety, let's say, of a contract that has been signed. I think he knows deep down that whether he has a contract signed or not doesn't really make any difference, because he has had contracts signed for multiple years, like he was when he drove for Racing Point, now Aston Martin. He had a deal for the first time for multiple years, and it was just 1 year because they signed Vettel in his place. So he knows that if he doesn't perform, regardless of what kind of contract he has, it's going to be very tough to see the end of the contract. So I guess, he knows, and he has told me many times that ultimately he has to deliver every weekend.
And one last thing I wanted to ask you, Diego, on Perez, because you're very plugged into this. What's the perception in his home country about the recent struggles? How's that responded to? Is it just seen as Red Bull making life hard for him? Is it seen as Perez underperforming? How do they frame it generally?
Well, it's always very difficult to say something, let's say, leveled about this, because hardcore fans think in some way, Mexican fans that are not really into Formula One but just follow it because of Checo have a different view. Maybe the biggest portion of Checo's fan base is fans that just want to see him succeed regardless of whatever. So they would, point fingers at the team, at Red Bull, at Helmut Marko, at the Checo's engineer. Checo has somewhat driven away from all the noise that goes around him for a long time now, and obviously there's a big portion of the fan base that have been for some time asking for a change on his side of the garage. They want to see a different engineer. They want to see a different dynamic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to happen, or that is the solution. I guess Red Bull knows much better than we do what Checo needs, what things are working and what things aren't working in his side of the garage as they should. It's difficult to sort of read exactly what the overall view is about Checo and his struggles in Mexico. But I think it's safe to say that regardless of whether he struggles or not, most of the fan base will still back him up.
Yeah, well, he's an absolute megastar in Mexico, and for good reason. I'm sure some better results will be ahead. Well, Mark, let's move on to our final topic, because last week there was a potentially significant change to the International Sporting Code, most notably allowing exemptions to be made for the requirement to be 18 for a super licence. So that points to Kimi Antonelli, doesn't it? What do you make of this?
Yeah, it's interesting. We don't know if it's in response to something that was requested much earlier in the season when I think Williams was quite keen to get him in the car much more so than Toto Wolff, who I think responded by saying, no, I don't want this, I don't want to put him under any more pressure. Just let him continue his F2 season and whatever. And whether it's now a dead subject, but the request has sort of gone through the process and led to them making this decision that under the FI's discretion, a 17-year-old could be deemed worthy of a super license, or whether it's from some fresh impetus because they want to make it happen. Now his birthday, he's 18 in August, so if it's the latter case, it's going to be quite imminent, isn't it? But because it wouldn't be an issue after August anyway. So it's going to be interesting. It will, if we do see him anywhere before he does the expected thing of taking Lewis Hamilton's seat at Mercedes next year, we'd expect it to be in Sargent's car at Williams.
And of course, we should say they also changed the requirement to have a road driving licence as well, because if he was to get one in Italy, he couldn't get one because you have to be 18 in Italy. That's a more minor one. That, I guess, levels things.
Yeah. I mean, Max Verstappen had already won a Grand Prix before he got a road licence.
Well, exactly. Well, it's strange, isn't it? Because to me, it should be about level of competence and achievement. And the argument on this, that should be you can make an exemption because if you've got the point system and a driver meets that point system, as Antonelli does, then why shouldn't you let them in should somebody want them to? So I guess that's the rationale behind making this possible. And we should say it's not a lowering of the age, it's just allowing for an exemption. But I'd be interested to know what you think, Jay. Obviously, there's a huge amount of interest in Antonelli. Would you like to see him thrown into F1 action, even if it's just some FP1 outings? Because, of course, the same rules apply to the FP1 only super licenses.
Yeah, although I must say I would first like to see him do something quite special in F2, because I must say up until now I haven't. I'm sure some of that is Prema maybe not being right up there like they have been usually in F3 and F2, talking about this year. Although Berman has probably had some more flashes than his teammate there. But yeah, I guess if Mercedes has done all this, or Williams or whoever, if Mercedes have given them all this F1 testing that they are giving him and will give him for the rest of the year, is because they definitely have seen something quite special, not only now, but from some years ago, from the years he has been part of their young driver program. So it's exciting. Hopefully he is the next Italian F1 championship caliber driver. It's been a while since we've had one. And yeah, every time a young, exciting talent comes in, you really want to see those drivers come up and fight for the title.
And obviously, Mark, that relative lack of results in F2 is quite an interesting talking point for people. I mean, there's good reason why drivers like Behrman and Antonelli are the ones who are being talked of and will like to get F1 seats next year. And it just shows, doesn't it, that if you're with a team, even in one-make racing, even a great team like Prema in a one-make series, if they haven't quite got a handle on the car, it can actually make it very difficult for outstanding drivers to show what they can do.
Yeah, and we know the caliber of Behrman from already from his few F1 appearances, and it's notable that as teammates they go up and down the grid together. So it does look like it's a team problem rather than an Antonelli problem or a Behrman problem, because when they're relatively quick, they're relatively quick together, and when they're slow together. They go up and down the grid at the same races. There's not this disparity between them. So it does look like they haven't got a handle on the car. I've spoken to Antonelli about what he feels it's lacking, and he said it's just you cannot drive it in the way that you really need to fully extract your entry speed. He said because the race stability just doesn't allow you to lean on it. It just, not that you can't, not that it's going to throw you off the road, just that it doesn't respond. It doesn't give you the consistency of response to be able to drive it in the way that you want. And he's interestingly said that the 22 Mercedes, which is the original ground effect Mercedes pretty much universally trashed by George Russell and Lewis Hamilton as a bad car. He said that car feels fantastic. And he said for him, he says, I can drive it exactly the way I want. And he said that car just is beautiful. But he's taken a very different reference point than the others. Of course, he's taken his reference as his F2 car. But it's interesting. He says, I can drive that car exactly how I want to drive it, whereas the F2 car at the moment, I can't. He said, well, he thought that we're making progress and getting towards a better level of understanding why it was like this. But this was a couple of races ago. So I think, hopefully we will see that special performance in F2 before too much longer. Interesting that it's even a bad, what's termed as a bad car. He loves. So let's see.
There's two things that leap to mind from that. Firstly, it shows how important that old car, F1 car running is for Antonelli's case, because he's able to make a much stronger case with that for a Mercedes seat next year than in a tricky F2 campaign. But also, I did an interview with Jack Doohan the other day, who's a candidate for the Alpine seat, and he was saying that one of the benefits of a young driver is they don't have preconceptions of, it's been like this in Formula One before, I want the car to do this, that, and the other. They come in adaptable and open-minded, and that's probably been quite fun for Mercedes as well to see that from Antonelli. So he's doing his case making in the shadows, as it were. And make no mistake, Antonelli is very, very good, and it's still trending towards him being in a Mercedes next year. But Diego, also on this topic, there was some griping stateside about the fact the FIA is willing to make exemptions possible for the age rule, but not for the super license point requirement. Of course, that reignites the whole Colton Herta debate. So do you think there's an argument for exemptions being allowed there?
Yeah, I remember Colton tweeted about this time last year that even Brad Pitt got a super license before him. And now that these days that the F1 movie is in the news again. So yeah, I think that there is an argument to be had about that. Colton is a very talented and a very capable driver for sure. There's been a lot of talk about how good he was compared to Norris back in their early days in the lower formula in the UK. Some drivers develop much better than others, so it's very hard to judge how good Herta can be in F1 if he was given the chance based on what happened many years ago in a very low power, low aero car. Some of the arguments that were given at the time for denying his super license, I quite don't understand fully, but I guess it goes basically to not going through the ring, and by the ring I mean F3 and F2, because if you compare it's two different cases. Herta basically made his career he had some in the UK and Europe. He did the Spanish Formula 3 and he won many races there, but he didn't do the current F3 or GP3. He didn't do Formula 2. He did it the American way, let's say, while we are talking about Antonelli, who did all this, and he has his super license points even before he did Formula 2. So it's two different cases. And I guess the question is, should success in IndyCar fast track you towards a super license? I think that if that is validated by an F1 team that carries a testing program with you, as McLaren has done with Herta, I think it should, because the team ultimately has enough data to back up whether a driver has enough capability to race at the F1 level, So if the team believes so, and if they want to risk having that driver on the grid, they want to take that risk because they feel they have enough data to back that up. Why shouldn't they be allowed to do so? But as Alexander Rossi, also, he was a teammate at Andretti with Herta before he switched to McLaren. He was one of those who put the point out on the social media when he said, okay, so exceptions can be made when this new Antonelli rule has been put on the Formula One regulations, or the Appendix L, as it's called.
I think there's also a couple of different things going on here, because actually, if I don't think the argument that if they're willing to make it possible to have exemptions for the age rule, they should be willing to make exemptions for the license points rule. I don't think that holds water, because you can make exceptions on age ground in exceptional circumstances if they hit the points, because your points is your primary measure. However, I do agree that the IndyCar points should be upped, because, I mean, for example, you finish fourth in F2, you get 30 points. Finish fourth in IndyCar, you get 10 points. So I think things can be upped. If you're first in IndyCar, you get 40 points, which is super license access. Straight away, you need 40 for a super license. So I think that can certainly change, and I think that's a valid argument. Although I think we have to be careful about conflating the two. I would also say, as a footnote, maybe Colton Herta's struggled to develop a hugely talented driver. He's won quite a few races in IndyCar. Maybe Andretti's not been the easiest team of late, but I'd still like to see him evolve at a greater rate. So almost his case is fractionally weaker now than it was at the point when he had a shot at a drive. But I certainly think he's still shown plenty. What do you think, Mark? Do you think they just need to up the IndyCar points a bit, just to reflect the fact that's a top-line series?
I think it should be, yeah. In terms of challenge, it should at least be left with F2, arguably valued higher. And I think the point Diego made, that it's difficult not to see it from the perspective of the FIA wanting to ring fence its own championships and not have an easy route in from outside the FIA. And I think it's very short-sighted. I think anybody that shows serious potential in IndyCar, to talk about Colton Herta, we could talk about Alex Palou, we could talk about Pato Award, they should, for me, they're automatic super licenses. They're just a caliber of driver that's obviously going to be competitive. Quite how competitive and quite how good, but easily worthy of a place on the F1 grid. And it shouldn't even be a discussion. I find it ridiculous.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. He's won 7 IndyCar races. If you do that shows you're capable. So I think it's about reframing the points. I wouldn't like a situation where you have to make an exception to the points for these drivers. You should change the points. So I think that's the simple solution there. Whether that will change, who knows? But yeah, it's just a little bit needless, and I think there is a little bit of politics at play in that one. Although personally, I don't actually think it's F1 being anti-American. That's not my view. I just think it's being F1 just being a little bit too focused in its own little ecosystem. But anyway, that debate's going to run and run. Well, thanks, Diego and Mark, for your insights. Some great stuff there. Head to therace.com, loads to read. Our YouTube channel as well, where both in English and Spanish you can watch our videos, and plenty of other podcasts, including our IndyCar podcast with Jack Benyon and JR Hildebrand, which is well worth a listen, seeing as we've been touching on IndyCar in this podcast. We're going to pack our bags and head off to Barcelona now, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Spanish Grand Prix.
The Athletic.